Well, good day, YouTubers. Welcome to the third part of a series I've done on the southern end of Moreton Bay. In this video, I'm going to cover the anchorages in a little bit more detail and talk about them. I'm going to look at some of the fishing spots that I have caught something at, which is not very many. And I'm going to mark off some of the fishing spots that I've been told about. They're not secret. I was just told I'll go into this area. I wasn't given a GPS mark or anything on them, so there's nothing secret about them. They may or may not produce fish. I know they don't for me, but I think that is my technique down the southern end of the bay. I think I'm just not into fishing down that end of the bay because a lot of people I know do very well down there. My grandfather did very well fishing down that area, but he was into mullet gut and powell gut and things like that for bait, which I never really got into. I did try them, but I get one bite and they were off the hook and I never caught anything on it, so I lost interest in those sort of baits. But he did very well with them, so it could be just my technique and the baits I'm using. It doesn't work for me anyway. But that's enough of that. Let's get on with the video. I'll start down the bottom end of the southern bay again and work my way up, talking about the anchorages. Now, I've drawn yellow lines around some of the areas that I know boats anchor a lot. It doesn't necessarily mean that I've anchored there. I have in some of them, but not all of them. However, I've been down past these areas a lot and I have often seen boats anchored in these particular spots, so they must be reasonably good anchorages. It could be that someone's gone along and anchored there and everyone else has looked at it and said, oh, that must be a good anchorage because he's there, and gone over there. But because they've been used over the years, I don't think that's the case. I think they're more than likely good anchorages. Possible exception would be tipplers, where there's a tavern and a lot of guys will tie up there regardless of how bad the anchorage is because there's a tavern there. But again, I don't really think that's the case. I think tipplers is not a bad place to pull into the beach on. Now, while I've marked areas that are more popular than others, there's no hard and fast rules about where you can and can't anchor down the southern end of the bay. I have seen boats anchored everywhere there. Some of the most unlikely spots I would have thought, I've seen boats tied up there. Usually the bigger boats like to sit there and camp for a few days. They'll tie up in just some of the oddest spots. Main thing is to watch the tides, make sure you've got enough water, make sure your swing of your boat is not going to put you into the shallows. Make sure you anchor up far enough out of the channel that you're not going to swing across the channel if the tide changes or the wind changes, because it's just bad seamanship to have your boat blocking a channel. And if you're staying overnight, it's just downright dangerous because if the other guy's not keeping a good lookout and you're in the channel, it could be a disaster. Also, staying away from the channel is a good idea because some of those channels get pretty busy and the boat wash can be quite annoying at times. If you're looking at this video on a computer, I don't think you'll have any trouble seeing the yellow lines I've drawn, but I'll just mention that if you're looking at it on a tablet or a mobile phone, you may need to zoom in a bit to see the yellow lines I've marked at the popular anchorages. Another thing I've often seen when I've been down in this area is blokes camped on these islands. Now, it's always been where there's a particularly sharp drop-off on the island and they can go right up to the shore, and they just pull up to the edge of the island and set up their tent on one of the flat areas where there's no mangroves. There's a lot of areas around like that. I've never done it myself, mainly because a lot of the islands are swampy and mangrovey and you get the big horseflies coming out to the boat, and it just didn't appeal to me to camp with that sort of, how should I put it, discomfort. When I camp I do like to be comfortable, and yes, there's horseflies on nearly all the islands throughout the bay. There have been seasons where they haven't been around, but in general you'll find them everywhere. But I don't see any sense in seeking them out. I don't want to put you off camping on one of these islands if that's what you want to do. I just want to forewarn you to take a good supply of insect repellent. When you're picking a spot to anchor, the main thing you want to look at is the prevailing wind, and you want to be in against the island so that the island breaks the wind and you're not copying it. Sometimes you'll get the swell coming along the channels, not so much down the southern end of the bay, but as you go further north and things start to open up, you can often shelter from the wind and the wind wave, but you'll still get some swell coming around the corners and giving you a bit of a rock. Usually not too bad, but just be aware because you're in against the island doesn't necessarily mean that you won't get rocked at all. And this area that I've got circled here was one memorable occasion where I actually caught some fish away from the pin. It was memorable for another reason too. It was dropping tide. I think it was getting on towards low tide, but I couldn't swear to that as a few years ago. But I know there was about a foot of water over the mud bank there, and what I did was I nosed the boat into the mud bank. Now very, very slowly, just enough to get the nose onto the mud, enough to hold the boat there. Wasn't much current running, so it must have been getting on to the bottom of the tide. The boat just sat out there at 90 degrees from the bank, and the back of the boat was in 12 feet of water. It dropped down sheer off that bank. And what I did was I just threw the lines out along the drop-off and caught a good bag of whiting there. Now, I remember they definitely weren't elbow slappers, but they were good legal size whiting, and I got a good feed of whiting out of there. So there you go, you can give that a go if you go past. Also, the other thing about it is it demonstrates just how sharply those channels can drop off beside the islands. I have actually seen large 40-foot boats tied up against the islands. The drop-off was just so steep that they actually put some stakes into the ground on the islands and tied themselves off to them. I'll just add a warning at this point. Tying your boat up to any fixed structure requires a little bit of knowledge, so don't go doing it unless you know what you're doing. If you've got a big boat, you should be setting up springers and everything as well as your main lines into the shore, and you need to have enough slack in it so your boat can move around with the tide. I'm not going to go into that in detail now. I just wanted to mention that you have to allow for tidal movement and don't end up like the fellow in the picture. Now I'll just run through some of the fishing spots that I know down around the southern end of the bay. I'm not the greatest fisherman down that way. I don't have a great deal of luck. Around the pin area is one place where I haven't done too badly. I've already covered that in the first video in this series, so if you haven't seen that, I'll refer you back to that video, just showing the areas here for completeness because I'm putting all the fishing areas in this one little segment. But if you want to know more about these particular areas, go back and have a look at the first video where I think I give a little bit more detail on them. I'll just reiterate that there's some very strong currents in this particular area here. It's right in front of the jumping pin bar. Exercise an appropriate degree of caution, particularly if you're inexperienced on the water. This is another area that I spoke of in the first episode, and that's the salt works. Sound along the yellow line and see if you can find some prawns there. Throw your cast net in and catch them. Lots of boats do it with great success, although I've never tried it myself. Next, there's the power lines on the western side of Russell Island to the mainland. There's a lot of pylons across that expanse of water to support the power lines. During prawning season, you'll see the boats collected there throwing their cast nets in. They usually collect between two of the pylons. I just forget whether it's the second and third or the third and fourth. I think it's one of those two, but you can't miss it. If it's prawning season, you'll see the boats there all throwing their cast nets around. This is another spot that I've never tried fishing myself, but I am told that there's a lot of fish around the pylons. It's like the bridges or the beacons in the northern end of the bay. The fish like to collect around the structure, and apparently you can pull up near the pylons and have a few casts and likely land something. At least that's what I've been told by several people. I wouldn't make the trip specially to do it unless you have some firmer information on it than what I have. What I have is second and third hand, but if you're going past and you want to pull up, have a go, see how it goes. I also covered the Logan River in the first episode. I haven't done any prawning there myself, but I have seen the prawns on the sounder in the Logan, and I have been there quite a bit mud crabbing. Great spot for mud crabs. There's obviously going to be areas between the Logan and the Pin which would also produce mud crabs, I reckon. But I haven't actually tried mud crabbing there. I get enough out of the Logan when I go, so I know where to find them. I don't waste time looking anywhere else. Now this area between Russell and Stradbroke is an area that I have tried fishing. The little green dot marks the approximate location of a green buoy. A little bit to the a little bit to the southwest of that, there is a deep hole. Now, I haven't caught anything out of that deep hole. I've only fished it a couple of times, but I did lose a very good lure there to something. Don't know what it was, but it was a decent sized bit of fun to play until it bit me off and took my lure. I have heard of other people getting a bag of fish out of that hole, so if you're over there and have a bit of time to spare, it could pay dividends to drop a line in. Coming up the Keechie Mudlow, the rectangle there, the yellow rectangle, is the new artificial reef. I've never fished that, but I'm told it's pretty much like the Peel artificial reef. It'll have its good days and bad days. The other mark, the X beside the red buoy on the southeast corner of the island, is where I used to fish many years ago. Drop a line down quite close to the buoy, on the side of the buoy away from the island, and used to pull some good fish out of there. Another spot that I haven't fished for many years, but used to produce the goods and may still be worth a shot. In the last episode I said I'd point out some spots at the top end of Macleay, and the red line there is around the drop-off on the top end of Macleay. That's a good spot to look for some squire, maybe some smaller snapper and some sweetlip. Might get the odd other fish there, but that was the main thing I used to catch in that area. The yellow cross is where I had this tremendous session of pulling fish up that I talked about in the last video. Line no sooner hit the water than I had something on. I got busted off more than I landed. Just had a great afternoon there. I did go back there on a couple of subsequent occasions and pulled up the odd fish, but never repeated that session. Assuming that the beacon is in the same spot as it used to be, and that's pretty much the case, the beacons in Moreton Bay don't move around much. Line up the beacon with that point on the island, as I've shown in the yellow line that's sort of running north-northeast, east, south-southwest. You get the other yellow line, that's the one that runs west-northwest down to east-southeast, by lining up those 2 points on the island. Once they're lined up, you're on that line. Have a sound around there, see if you can turn up any fish. If you're lucky, you might get a repeat of the day I had there many years ago. In between the northern end of Macleay and Blakesley's Anchorage is the Pelican Banks. That was always a really good spot for whiting. Just figure out which way the current's running and try to drift along the edge of the bank and cast across onto the shallows. Anytime the whiting are running, you should pick some up there. Same caveat as always, I haven't fished this area in many years. Everything I'm talking about fishing in this area is information that is years old, but a lot of it I can't see any reason why it might have changed as far as fish habitat goes. However, it may have been overfished. There's always a possibility with all the boats out on the water these days. And just to the north of the Pelican Banks is the Pelican Gutter. Bit of a gutter running down through there and drop-offs either side of it. You pick up the odd decent fish out of that. I used to just drop a line down and have a drift through the gutter. I don't remember ever anchoring up and burleying, but that could also be worth a shot. And of course, as always, if there's nothing on the fish sounder, it's just not worth stopping and trying. And finally, the drift down along this bank was my favourite fishing spot for whiting in the entire Southern Bay. I could always go over there and in an hour or so come home with a feed. On the right tide, of course. Now I'm sorry, that was more years ago than I care to admit, and I cannot for the life of me remember what tide it was I used to fish. I know it was between the half tide and the low, but I can't remember whether it was a half tide going to the low or the low going up to the half tide. I have a feeling it was the half tide to the low, but in any event, you'll only have to fish it for a couple of days and you'll figure it out which way is the best fishing. Well, that's it for the video, and it wraps up the series. I hope it's encouraged you to go down around that end of the bay and do some exploring for yourself, and I hope if you do that you manage to catch more fish than I ever have down there. Pin area's been pretty good to me, but other than that I haven't done all that well. But as I say, lots of people do, so your mileage may vary. I do have some other videos planned doing the central part of the bay and the northern part of the bay, so those videos are in the planning stage. I may come back and do another one on the southern end of the bay. There's some really fascinating history down that end of the bay, so I may come back and do that one day. I'd like to share that with everyone, but that's way off in the future. Might do it maybe 12 months' time. I've got a lot of videos planned in the meantime. But, I find history fascinating, and particularly local history, so I would like to do it, but as I said, a lot of other videos planned that I'd like to do first. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. If you'd like to see more of my videos, you can go to my YouTube channel. Don't forget to click that like button, comment and subscribe for more. Until next time, good fishing.